Hi, welcome to the channel Coder's Arc, where we unravel the world of coding and architecture together. And today I'm going to talk about Amazon S3 pre-signed URLs. Currently, I'm working on an Amazon SageMaker video where I will show you how to upload a CSV dataset to Amazon S3 securely, and from there, create a model, train a model, deploy that model, and use that model to make some predictions. One of the first steps in that workflow is uploading a CSV dataset to Amazon S3 securely. Now, whether you have that same workflow or slightly different workflow where you just want to upload a file to S3 securely and from there trigger an ETL workflow. Whatever your scenario is, by the end of this video, you will understand what is a pre-signed URL, how is it created, and why is it preferred over uploading a file to Amazon S3 endpoint directly. So let's dive right into it. Let's dive into the definition of S3 pre-signed URL. A pre-signed URL uses the security credentials to grant time-limited permission to download or upload the objects. The URL can be entered in a browser or used by a program to download the object, or can be used to upload the objects using the pre-signed URL using the Postman or web application HTTPS call with the file content as payload. The credentials used by the pre-signed URL are those of the AWS user who generated the URL. Before we take a look at how the S3 pre-signed URL work, let's take a look at how to upload an object to an S3 bucket without the pre-signed URL. Here in this diagram, you can see a user is logged into the front-end web app. It could be either Vue, Angular, or React.js. And from there, they will use the AWS SDK along with AWS credentials to directly upload the object to the S3. Now, this approach is not secure and is not the preferred approach. We need a more secure approach like pre-signed URL to upload the objects onto the S3 bucket. Now, let's take a look at how to upload a CSV file or any file to an S3 bucket using the pre-signed URL. There are basically two main steps. First is invoking a backend API endpoint to get the pre-signed URL. And the second step is using this pre-signed URL to upload the file contents. I will share a diagram and an architecture that will show the secure steps and also share some code snippets at the end. In this diagram, you can see you are using an identity provider first to get an access token. I won't go much into the details of the OAuth 2 flow, but it is important for you to see that the front-end web application which is about to access an endpoint to get the pre-signed URL will need to make a call to that endpoint using an access token. And the steps to get an access token are that you supply the credentials from the identity provider, you will get the OAuth code, then you will use that OAuth code and the client ID and the client secret to get that access token. And this is the access token that will use to invoke the Amazon API Gateway endpoint. Behind the scenes, there is an AWS Lambda that is working in integration with the Amazon API Gateway. So now once you have the access token, you will make a call to the Amazon API Gateway to get the pre-signed URL. The access token is passed in the request header. Now the AWS Lambda, which is hooked up to the Amazon API Gateway endpoint, will take this access token and pass it to the Lambda authorizer, and the Lambda authorizer is going to validate the JWT token and ensure that the token is valid before proceeding to generate the pre-signed URL. This step ensures the first level of security. Now, as a part of the second level of security, you want to ensure that the Lambda that is going to generate the pre-signed URL has an IAM role that it acquires during runtime to access the S3 bucket. So you can see that once it acquires a role which has enough IAM permissions to access the object in an S3 bucket, it is going to generate the pre-signed URL. Now this pre-signed URL is sent back over to the front-end web application. And finally, the front-end web application uses this URL to make a post or a put request call to the S3 bucket URL directly. and upload the file contents. Now, let's take a quick look at the code that is needed to generate the pre-signed URL. Let's first take a look at the backend code. Here, you can see an endpoint, get pre-signed URL, which is an HTTP GET endpoint, where you will create a get pre-signed URL request. This code is written in C# .NET Core, but in your different languages like Python and Java, there would be similar implementation. As part of the parameters, you supply the bucket name, the object key, the HTTP verb, and the file content type. And one very important parameter here is the expires parameter, which specifies the time duration for which the pre-signed URL is valid. During that time duration, you can upload the file over and over again until the pre-signed URL time expires. And finally, you pass that request to the get pre-signed URL from the AWS SDK and get the pre-signed URL. Now this URL is supplied to the front-end code, and let's take a quick look at the front-end code. Before we look at the front-end code, one very important thing that I forgot to mention is that you have to enable the cores and headers and origins from which the request is originating. This is very important, and I've highlighted this in this code. This is a React application, and as you can see, first we make an Axios get call to the get pre-signed URL with the request options. In the request options, basically you're passing the access token as a header. And then finally, you get the pre-signed URL. Once you get the pre-signed URL, you're going to make an Axios put call to that pre-signed URL with the file contents and the appropriate configuration to get the file contents uploaded on that pre-signed URL. Now, one very important thing over here is that you need to make sure that the domain from which you are invoking the pre-signed URL endpoint has the cores options enabled on the S3 backend. So let's take a quick look at the S3 configuration on the AWS console. So now we are in the AWS console, and I'm sharing the cores setting. As you can see, this is the JSON that represents the core setting. Here, I have set the allowed headers to be star. Obviously, this is just a demo application, so I'm allowing all headers, but you need to be very careful around what headers you will allow. Again, allowed methods are the HTTP methods that are allowed at that bucket. HTTP put, head, post, delete, and other HTTP methods. Allowed origins, again, in my demo application, I'm allowing all origins, but in a production scenario, you need to be very careful around which origins you will allow the requests to be originating from for this bucket. And finally, the expose headers. You need to be very careful on how you set the core setting in a production scenario. And that's all I wanted to cover on this slide. So in this video, I covered what is a pre-signed URL, how is it generated, and how you can use a pre-signed URL to upload your contents onto an S3 bucket. Now, I know it is a very simple concept, but I have seen most developers and architects confuse it with the direct S3 upload. So hopefully that clears this for you. In the next video, I want to cover an Amazon SageMaker pipeline from end to end, where I will show how you will use a pre-signed URL to upload a CSV data and then train, deploy, and use the model to make the predictions. So hopefully you found the value in this content useful, and if you did, please hit the subscribe and the like button, and also let me know in the comment section what videos you would like to see next. Thank you for now.